And so while we're having a party, let's talk about fascism. Hi, my name is Amelia Nagoski, and today we're celebrating. It's 2022, and officially, the ICD-11 is in full effect. That's right, the ICD-11, the International Classification of Diseases, International Classification of Diseases, 11th revision. It's in full effect now. And guess what's not in there? Asperger syndrome. Woo! Revision 10 held that Asperger syndrome was a separate situation from autism, unlike the DSM-5 in America, in particular, that got rid of Asperger's as a diagnosis separate from autism and just created one big umbrella, umbrella of autism, and the whole spectrum of autism fell under it. And now the ICD-11 says the same thing, that there's just autism. The underlying features of difficulty with social communication, with emotional reciprocity, rigid behaviors, repeated stereotyped behaviors, those things are true across the board regardless of intellectual ability or speech development. Yay! Everything I know about decorating for a party I learned when I was 8 years old. And also I grew up super poor, according to the US federal government, we were living below the poverty line. So what I learned about party decorations is why go out and buy something when you've got items lying around the house that are ugly and inferior and nothing at all like what you want. You can just go ahead and use those and be disappointed. How much time did I spend making construction paper party decorations? Don't worry about that. That's not the point here. Okay, I'm taking this crown off because it is distracting me. I'm celebrating today because over this past weekend I read Asperger's Children by Edith Schaeffer. My favorite thing about the book is that she is a historian and she brings the receipts. She goes to original sources, primary sources, and gives you the quotes directly from the documents. So a lot of it is in Asperger's own words. So we see exactly the thing that makes me so happy that his name is gone as a separate diagnosis. His name is still in there as a also known as, because things are also called, and that's listed in the ICD-11. So Asperger's name is still in there as you might hear this as, but officially the diagnosis is autism without intellectual, blah, 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 all that extra stuff. So what we learned from Asperger's own words is that he was 100% a eugenicist. He 100% believed that people's worth depended on their value to the community, to what they could contribute to other people's lives. And yeah, he was 100% complicit in the murder of disabled children. And he was 200% a sexist asshat. Because the value of a girl was to grow up and become a woman whose job was to have babies and take care of the home. And why would it be a value for that person to have intense knowledge about an abstruse area of interest? In fact, he placed different values on the boys even depending on what that area of interest was. They're kind of what we might refer to as a special interest, the thing that they know everything about and will talk about even if you don't ask them about it. Let's talk about Brandon Sanderson some more. Depending on what that interest was, he believed that child was more or less valuable. If you're interested in science, chemistry, then yeah, you could be of service to the Reich. And if not, then you're just not literally worthy of life. Literally, the words that he said were worthy of life. Life worth living. The fuck? Besides the words of Asperger himself, the thing that I found most fascinating in Edith Schaeffer's book was her idea that autism was really everything anti-fascism. And so while we're having a party, let's talk about fascism. The term fascism was coined by Mussolini, and the idea is that the fascia in your body kind of wraps around and binds together the muscle so that individual muscle fibers are connected together in a way that makes them stronger, right? The fascia. And Mussolini's idea was that Italy would benefit from fascism instead of being all these like independent city-states as it had been for most of its history. Like there was the Roman Empire, which is a very unified big deal. And then basically from that point on, Italy was like city-states, separate muscles working independently of each other. And only in the late 19th century did Italy become kind of a unified nation, made of independent parts, but still unified. And the idea was that the fascism could bind together all these separate entities and create one powerful Italy. And as Asperger was being exposed to it, fascism was this idea that Germany as a nation, German nationality, like he lived in a different country. He lived in Vienna, Austria, which is a separate country from Germany. But the idea of a German nation, all the German-speaking peoples who shared these values and also like physical, racial characteristics and history and behavioral, economical stuff, were all one nation. When I used to teach nationalism to my undergraduates in my Music 101 class, because nationalism played a very important role in Romantic music of the late 19th century, I was lucky enough to be teaching in Massachusetts, so it was real easy to frame it in terms of the Red Sox nation, right? They're the Boston Red Sox. They're the team that plays in Boston. Their stadium's in Boston. They're the Boston Red Sox. But Red Sox Nation is the term they use to describe the fan base that is definitely Boston and like expanding through like most of Massachusetts and even into like New Hampshire, Vermont, maybe Maine, like Red Sox Nation, or anyone is like the whole Red Sox diaspora. So if you're a Massachusetts resident who becomes a Red Sox fan and moves to North Carolina, you are still a member of Red Sox Nation, even though you live geographically not in the nation. That's the sense of nation that we're talking about when we talk about the German nation. Robert Paxton is the academic who's kind of laid out the most coherent dissection of what fascism really is. He wrote a book called The Anatomy of Fascism. And in it he says fascism doesn't have a driving philosophy or like economic reasoning. Like Marxism is based on economic reasoning and logic and a philosophy. But fascism is driven by what he calls 7 mobilizing passions, not logic or ideals or reasons, but passions. And 5 of the 7 passions are about the group. Number 1 is the primacy of the group, which just means that like the group is more important than the individual. If there was a pitcher on the Red Sox and they started to pitch very badly, then no matter how big a fan you were of that particular player, when they start to bring down the Red Sox as a team, you are willing to like let go of that individual player. Look, Johnny Damon. I was a very, very big Johnny Damon fan in the early 2000s. And when he moved to the Yankees, that was like a violation. He moved from Red Sox Nation to the Yankees, who is this bitter rival. But who do you stay fans of, Johnny Damon or Red Sox? It's obvious to most people that it's the Red Sox. It was not obvious to me. I was like, well, he's still Johnny Damon. That's not the way you're supposed to feel about it. And I'm autistic, so I didn't know that. The second thing is the victimhood of the group. My husband talks about how he was a Red Sox fan from the time he was a kid. So from the 1960s to the 1970s and 80s, when the Red Sox were not winning. He was still a fan. And he talks about how it's hard to be a fan of a team that loses. But according to Robert Paxton, the idea of the primacy of group actually makes it sort of even stronger. It actually binds you even closer. Number 3 is the dread of decline. Oh my God, the Red Sox finally won the World Series. Now what if we start losing again? Which inevitably did happen, is happening. Number 4 is integration. That is making allies with like groups to combine your strengths. I'm not sure this applies to Red Sox Nation because I'm not really saying that being a Red Sox fan or a sports fan in general is fascist, because it's definitely not, because it doesn't meet the criteria that Paxton lays out. But in my mind, as a baffled, confused, autistic person not understanding sports fandom, when I started reading this, I was like, Anyway, number 4 doesn't really work because the Red Sox can't like optimize their strength by coordinating with other groups. If it turned into like a war between the American League and the National League, then that would apply, but obviously it doesn't apply. Number 5 of the 7. Number 5 is the identity and belonging to the group, that being a member of Red Sox Nation is a source of pride, and it's part of who you are. I am a Red Sox fan. Like, if you want to be buried in your Red Sox jersey, you get some pride out of your identity as a Red Sox fan. 6 is the idea that a natural leader will rise to the top and people will just naturally follow him. Yes, him, because like the only leaders who have actually surfaced in a system like this are Hitler and Mussolini. Number 7 is violence, which is another way that baseball differs from actual fascism. Except for that bar fight. Only when you're watching a game. If you're out at a bar and you're watching a game, you're wearing your Red Sox shirt, your Red Sox hat, and, if somebody in there is wearing a Yankees jersey, there might be a fight, like a literal physical fight. My point in comparing being a fan of a sports team with being a fascist is not to imply that sports teams are fascist. It's to imply that there's something innate in people, broadly speaking, that drives them to believe and to feel that being a member of a group is fundamental to their individual self, is part of who they are. And indeed, every school that I've attended has had some kind of like school pride sort of movement of, I attended this school and I'm going to go back to my reunion because I'm, Bulldog pride or whatever. And, go Blue Hens. University of Delaware. The blue hen is the mascot because you can't call them blue cocks. I have never felt school pride. I have never felt driven to go back to a school once I graduated and like revel in being on campus again, or to just sort of blanket, just have pride. Like, it never made sense to me that people would say, oh, they're the best team, even though there's like literal scores saying, who won and by how much to say who is the best team. Like, you just can't argue that a team is the best team if they lost, because clearly someone else was better. But people all the time say that their team's the best team out of no logic at all, just feeling and loyalty. Okay, yeah, cool. Like, you feel that, I get it. And one of the primary things that has always been part of the definition of autism since the very first time it was used to relate to mental state is that it refers to the inward turning of a person's mind to a self, to their individual. The first person who used it was Dr. Eugen Bleuler, Eugene Bleuler, but in German, Eugen Bleuler. So I'm going to take every opportunity I can to say Eugen Bleuler. I have a synesthesia where I can taste words, and like, it's not necessarily always like a flavor, although sometimes it is. It's just, there's a taste, Broccoli has a taste, and it's complex, right? And it tastes like a lot of different things at the same time, like bitter and watery, but also like some kind of green chlorophyll kind of flavor. The way you would really try to describe the flavor of broccoli to someone who's never had it. That's the way words taste to me. Like, how can I explain to you what Eugen Bleuler tastes like when you've never tasted a word? Eugen Bleuler, Eugen Bleuler, Eugen Bleuler. Anyway, Eugen Bleuler was studying children with schizophrenia, which is also a concept that he invented, the idea of a split self, which all of these definitions have changed, all of the understanding has changed, but this is how it started. And he noticed that all these kids with schizophrenia that he labeled as schizophrenic had certain attributes in common, and some they did not have all in common, and one of the things that they did all have in common was this sense that they weren't really connected with the outside world, that making connections with other people and even objects was not their default, but rather they seemed to have a stronger inner life than connected life. So he called it autism, like selfness, selfism, like auto from the Greek. So other people picked up this word and this idea, and there was a psychiatrist in the United States who was an immigrant, so he's called Leo Kanner, Kanner, who is credited with being the first psychiatrist to identify autism as this like inward turned selfness, non-connectedness, outside of schizophrenia. Kanner published his book in 1943 and Asperger published in 1944. And they had both used this phrase, and clearly, the community gets interconnected, and the word changes use and meaning over time. Like, there are other really, really bananas things that people thought that autism was. Like, they would project these thoughts into autistic infants' minds and be like, it was like, Anna Freud had like a whole long description of it, but like, she's the daughter of Sigmund Freud, who, thumbs up for being, having to work hard being a Jew in Vienna at the turn of the 20th century, but like thumbs down for all the stuff he got wrong, and then thumbs up for like the idea of the unconscious mind, but thumbs down for all of the other misogynist garbage. Freud. So this idea that autism is an absorption in the self, it's a lack of the sort of natural, humane tendency to connect to others outside of you, to be identified primarily as the member of a group. Whereas fascism is primarily a story of interest in strengthening the group over strengthening the self. And so here's why I really am happy that there is no Asperger syndrome anymore. To this day, the idea of Asperger syndrome carries a kind of prestige that the kind of autism that you have is better because it makes you more valuable to society. And that is kind of like fascist ideology. The idea that your value comes from what you have to contribute to other people. Emily told me a story that she was given a talk and she let people know that she's autistic. And somebody came up to her after the talk and said, "How come you said you're autistic? You didn't say you have Asperger's disorder, because like autism has such a stigma and Asperger's is like gold." And Emily said, "That's why." Now the good news is that there is no more Asperger syndrome. So we can go ahead and do the work of removing his name from common parlance. And I know that this is complicated because some people really value identifying as an Aspie, of having Asperger's. And why wouldn't they? I mean, for decades, that's what the diagnosis was. That was the name. And yes, it came with a kind of prestige that, oh, you have Asperger's syndrome, like you're some kind of mad genius. I mean, that's not always wrong. But it's also super fucked up to think that like some people's autism is superior to other people's autism, because those people who have intellectual disabilities and speech development challenges are just as valuable to humanity, and their humanity is fundamentally as valuable as somebody who's the mad genius, because individual humanity is innately valuable. Also, it undermines the struggles that people with autism without intellectual disability face. well, if you have Asperger's, then your life is easy. No. Because I still live in a system that, is the kind of system where fascism can rise, where some charismatic leader can come in and tell people that their group needs to bind together in order to be stronger and safe and protected, and for their identities to be upheld as members of that group. Somebody can do that because people do have that instinct to bind to groups. So good riddance, Asperger. Down with fascism.